Paul Snellgrove, the Associate Scientific Director of the Ocean Frontier Institute and a professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland. I want to recognize that the Ocean Frontier Institute's physical offices are located on ancestral and traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups in Atlantic Canada. Our institute is working hard to advance respectful and meaningful partnerships with Indigenous peoples. So welcome to the Ocean Frontier Institute's Social Sciences and Humanities Working Group People and the Ocean Speaker Series. This is actually the second of 8 webinars this year, featuring international experts who seek to understand complex interactions between society, economy, culture, and marine and coastal environments. Thank you all for coming, and my sincere thanks to the working group for organizing this impressive webinar series. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ian Stewart from Dalhousie University and a valued member of OFI's Social Science and Humanities Working Group to introduce today's speakers and discussants and moderate today's session. Ian.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, or even good evening, depending on where you are in the world joining us. Tiny correction, I'm actually a professor at the University of King's College, which is right cheek by jowl with Dalhousie University. It's my pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists, our presenter and our 2 discussants. Just before I do that, a quick summary of how the event is going to go today. Dr. Ben Belton will speak for about half an hour. And then Dr. Belton will be followed by our 2 discussants, Dr. Wright and Dr. Mather, who will each respond for approximately 5 minutes. And then we'll leave about 10 minutes for the 3 to respond to one another in total. Then there'll be roughly a half an hour for all of us to join in a Q&A. 2 things to ask you to note, please, that we will be only using the Q&A box to read, respond, and then present questions, read out questions from you as members of this, as participants in this panel. So please don't use the chat box, because we are, just for purposes of efficiency, wanting to focus our attention duly upon the Q&A box. Please, when you're writing your question, try to keep it brief so that in reading it, I can distill, or we can distill it into a quick question that we can present to the whole webinar. Also, please remember to keep your mics muted following normal Zoom etiquette. It's amazing that that's actually a word that we all know what it means. So it's my great pleasure to introduce first our presenter for today, Dr. Ben Belton, who is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. His background is in rural sociology, and he's worked extensively in South and Southeast Asia for more than a decade, including in Bangladesh, Thailand, and Vietnam. He's been at MSU since 2015. He's also based full-time in Burma as Deputy Chief of Party of the USAID-funded Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Security Policy in Burma, where he leads project research activities on agricultural commodity value chains, livelihoods, and the rural economy. Obviously, Ben is an expert on aquaculture and capture fisheries development and their value chains and their links to food, nutrition, and security. Our 2 discussants, respondents, are, in order that they'll appear, Dr. Julia Wright, who is the George Munro Chair of Literature and Rhetoric at Dalhousie University and is president of the Academy of the Arts and Humanities for the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Wright co-founded with Janine Farquharson at Memorial the Social Sciences and Humanities Oceans Research and Education Network, which spans Memorial and Dalhousie Universities. And it was my great pleasure to get introduced into social science and humanities research in the oceans through that some years ago. She's also the co-editor of the book series through Ashgate, the Ashgate series in 19th century transatlantic studies. Our second respondent is Dr. Charlie Mather, who is professor of geography at Memorial University. He is the co-lead of an Ocean Frontier Institute large research project on social license and planning in coastal communities. Together with colleagues at Memorial and Dalhousie, he's working on a range of topics related to aquaculture and social acceptability, broadly defined, including marine debris, salmon, natural cultures, feed bioeconomies, aquaculture as a frontier industry, and eco-certification. He works theoretically at the intersection between science and technology studies and the field of political economy. Ben, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Ian. I should just update my bio. I'm actually sharing a joint appointment between Michigan State University and WorldFish in Malaysia, and I'm the global lead for social and economic inclusion at WorldFish. And I'm actually calling in from Malaysia today. So good morning to everyone. I'm going to talk today about complicating contemporary narratives around marine finfish farming. And this is based largely on a paper that was published about a year ago in Nature Communications. First of all, about marine aquaculture, mariculture in the context of the emerging discourse of the blue economy. Then I'm going to look at some sort of previous narratives about the future of mariculture and the way that mariculture has been represented in the past. And then I'm going to move to the sort of new crop of contemporary science and policy that comes out of this sort of blue economy moment. Talking about 5 themes, sort of 5 new themes, I argue, that emerge from this literature: nutrition security, environmental sustainability, oceanic space, policy failures, and conservation. And then I'm going to talk about the implications, what I call the anti-politics of blue growth. First of all, there's been a recent boom in mariculture research, and the backdrop to this is this rising tide of interest and activity in the blue economy. So this is very nicely illustrated in this graph from Giuffre et al. And it illustrates what they call the blue acceleration. So this is the ramping up of economic activity in marine environments. And you can see over the past 2 decades, but really accelerating over the past decade, there's been a huge uptick in economic activity in the oceans, things like deep sea mining, shipping, offshore wind farms, marine protected areas, and also marine aquaculture. So what explains this is what you might call a spatial fix. So the idea is that as capital has sort of expanded throughout the globe under globalization, it's sort of run out of resources and space to incorporate, and the oceans have now become a new frontier for the expansion of capital accumulation. So there's been an upsurge in blue economy policy and science initiatives as a result. So for instance, we have the European Commission investing heavily in research on what it calls a sustainable blue economy. We have events like the World Ocean Summit organized by The Economist, which brings together representatives from government, industry, civil society to discuss the future of the blue economy. We have bodies such as the high-level panel on the sustainable ocean economy. And so a huge amount of activity in this space, and the production of a huge amount of publications. So this blue paper series, for instance, from the high-level panel, produced an influential report called The Future of Food from the Sea. but this then spawned another high-level scientific paper, and so the research is informing the policy is creating opportunities for the research, and there's a huge amount of activity going on. And this very often is presented in terms of win-wins or even win-win-win. So for instance, this infographic here from the ocean panel shows that we can have both ocean wealth, ocean health, and ocean equity simultaneously. So sort of moving on from that backdrop, I'd like to talk now about some older but as yet unrealized, I would argue, claims about the imperative to farm the seas. So going back to 1952, we have this statement that the oceans may someday produce a greater proportion of the food consumed by humans than is grown on land. Move forward 20 years to 1970, and we are now entering the era of mariculture. As the world's population expands, land farming will increasingly be unable to meet the ever greater demands for food. Again, 25 years later in 2005, following the cultivation of land for food, society must take the next step, large-scale domestication of the ocean. And more recently still, 2009, mariculture will constitute the next food revolution in human history. These are what might be called crisis narratives in political ecology. There's another more recent example here. Continued consumption and degradation of lands for terrestrial agriculture and urban development will destroy the world's remaining terrestrial and coastal biodiversity and novel ecosystems unless we plan for and invest in the development of ocean foods ecosystems for planetary survival. So sort of taking these as a whole and incorporating sort of other writings, I'd like to sort of break down the elements of this narrative. First of all, we have a rapidly growing seafood hungry population, and then there are many projections about large increases in demand for seafood by 2030, by 2050, and so on. So in effect, endless growing demand. We have the spectre of collapsing capture fisheries, which are thought to be which are presented as being in extremely bad shape. We have competition for agricultural land and fresh water. So scarcity of agricultural land, scarcity of fresh water, and we have conflicts over coastal space, which are preventing the act of aquaculture inshore. So the apparent solution to this crisis, as described, is to move fish farms into the ocean, and particularly to move them further offshore into this seemingly endless space, aquanice, you might call it, a blank slate, which can be brought into production. However, it's really important to understand that these processes that are described, although there are some elements of truth in each of them, are highly contextually specific. They're highly variegated. They're by no means universal trends that are common everywhere. So let's sort of break down the elements of the crisis narrative a bit. Endless demand. Well, if we look at seafood consumption in the global north, it's plateaued at around 25 kilograms per capita per year on average for a couple of decades at least. So most future demand for aquatic food is going to come from Asia, driven by higher incomes and to an extent by increasing population, and from Africa, driven by increasing population and to an extent by rising incomes. And so most of the populations of Africa and Asia for the foreseeable future are going to continue to demand primarily cheaper, low value fish. Some demand for higher value fish in Asia, certainly, but the vast majority of demand is for cheap, affordable fish. And I'll come back to the importance of that point later. With respect to the fishery supply constraint, certainly the growth potential of global capture fisheries is very limited, but that does not mean that their decline is inevitable. nor is it occurring everywhere in all fisheries in the same way. Many fisheries are fairly resilient to fishing pressure, some are rebuilding, and certainly fisheries are going to be a major source of aquatic food for the world for a very long time to come. They're not about to just disappear. Freshwater aquaculture supply constraints. So sort of in contrast to these generalized water shortages that are presented, actually the vast majority of aquaculture globally is taking place in major river deltas, particularly in the tropics, where there are few water shortages. And with respect to competition for agricultural land, actually most growth of aquaculture now on land is taking place through intensification, so higher productivity per hectare of land rather than through horizontal expansion. And there are still big yield gaps. There is a huge amount of scope to increase productivity from the existing area of land that's currently under aquaculture. And even in the places with the highest concentration of pond aquaculture in the world, so China, Bangladesh, for instance, they only account for 2% or less of total arable land. So there's really not a huge amount of competition going on here in the grand scheme of things. In terms of the supply constraint from coastal aquaculture, this is particularly an issue where there are strong regulatory regimes which restrict what can be done in the coastal environment, and this is particularly in the global north. It's less of a binding constraint in other parts of the world. So I'd like to make the case that the crisis narratives that support mariculture, but particularly now offshore mariculture, combine on the one hand a sort of Malthusian anxiety. So how are we going to feed the growing population of the world? On the one hand, with this sort of cornucopian techno-futurism, you might call it. And this is beautifully illustrated by these two pictures of an offshore fish farm. And it looks like something from science fiction. It really looks like the future. It's sort of incredibly visually appealing. And I think this really actually accounts for quite a lot of the appeal of offshore aquaculture, the fact that it just looks so futuristic. However, these narratives tend to disregard who would have access to the food that might be produced from this sort of dramatic expansion of mariculture. Okay, so I'd like to turn now to contemporary science and policy discourse around mariculture that's sort of come about at the same time as this sort of blue economy discourse. And you can see here there's been a proliferation of publications. This is a small selection of article headlines that have been published since 2017, often in leading journals, and there are many more. And so I'd like to go through sort of 5 kind of themes or claims that arise from this new body of literature that is perhaps different from or build on this previous sort of mariculture literature. So first of all, mariculture has the potential to benefit malnourished populations. This is a quote that illustrates the idea that mariculture is really going to contribute to food and nutrition security. So if you go back 10 or 15 years, mariculture was generally conceived of as being quite inequitable. So the way it was presented was taking small cheap fish, grinding them up and turning them into large expense, potentially at the expense of people who could have eaten the small fish. But now it's being reframed. But there's this sort of assumption that if we increase the production of seafood, then that will somehow directly translate into consumption increases, but there's really little consideration of what we might be producing and who might be able to eat it. So for instance, in this quote, offshore finfish aquaculture operations could be cited in developing countries to increase food security through income generation or increased access to seafood. So let's sort of break that down. So first of all, farming fish offshore entails very high production costs and very high investment costs. So first of all, marine environments offshore are hostile operating environments. There are high waves, there are strong currents, there are storms. This requires very robust infrastructure, very expensive infrastructure. Then operating far from shore also entails high fuel costs in order to go forwards and backwards. And all of the candidate fish species that can be grown offshore require high quality feeds that contain fish meal and oil, which is an expensive ingredient, or expensive substitutes for fish meal and fish oil. So by implication, offshore fish farming is going to have high production costs. That means the species produced are going to have to be high value species in order for it to be economically viable. There are going to have to be large economies of scale. This is not going to be a small scale activity. This is going to be very large scale. There are going to be high levels of automation, partly because of the operating environment, partly to limit labor costs. And so there are going to be few jobs created. So really, if we compare the main fish species that are farmed in freshwater with the main fish species that are farmed in marine environments, we find that marine fish are produced in smaller quantities, they're more expensive, and they're more resource consumptive. This is illustrated in these graphs here. So we have the red bars and circles are the top 20 species of fish in volume terms grown in marine environments. The blue bars and circles are the top 20 freshwater fish in volume, fish grown in freshwater environments. And you can see that the levels of production are much larger for the freshwater fish than for marine fish. The one you see that the price of marine fish is several times higher on average than the price of freshwater fish, so around $6 per kilo versus $2 per kilo. And you see that the trophic level of marine fish is considerably higher than the trophic level of freshwater fish that are farmed on average. So that means on average, marine farm fish are more carnivorous, farmed freshwater fish are more herbivorous on average. And so that means freshwater fish can consume, can incorporate cheaper vegetable ingredients into the diet easily. Marine fish are more dependent on more expensive fish and fish oil in the diet. And you can see there's a very clear relationship here between trophic level and price. The higher the trophic level, the higher the price, and also between the environment and the trophic level and the price. So basically, if we're talking about food security, if we're talking about nutrition, we're not going to be producing marine finfish in offshore cages. We're going to be concentrating primarily on producing cheaper freshwater species of fish. Okay, so second point, mariculture, according to this quote, could be one of the most ecologically sustainable forms of food production. So again, if you go back 15 years, 10 years, generally environmentalists would consider marine aquaculture to be, or certainly marine finfish aquaculture to be fairly unsustainable. So part of the claim here is that moving farms offshore is more sustainable than producing fish in cages in nearshore environments, because stronger currents further offshore disperse the waste, the pollution from the cages and dilute it. So that may be the case. However, life cycle assessment studies that consider the entire set of environmental impacts from production, from feed production including feed production, show consistently that most environmental impacts of finfish aquaculture are linked to feed production rather than the wastes that emanate from the farm itself. A second argument that's made in favor of the sustainability of mariculture is that improvements in feed technology have reduced dependence on marine resources, so fish meal and fish oil. And the example of salmon is cited very frequently. So there have been big gains in the efficiency with which salmon can utilize marine ingredients. And so we've gone from talking about tigers of the sea to people imagining a future in the not too distant future where there might be vegetarian salmon. So there have been really big improvements in efficiency. It takes about half as much fish to produce a salmon now as it did 10 years ago. However, it's important to understand that salmon have reached much higher feed efficiencies through massive investment in R&D and through very large selective breeding programs. And this has been possible because they're produced on such a large scale. That wouldn't be possible for other species that are produced in much smaller quantities. So if you want an analogy, a terrestrial analogy, think about broiler chickens, which are this highly modified animal that grows incredibly quickly, turns feed into meat incredibly efficiently, versus the guinea fowl, another domesticated bird that hasn't undergone anything like the same level of improvement and grows slowly and is expensive and is produced in small quantities. So just to illustrate this, this is a series of graphs from a life cycle assessment study of marine aquaculture. This is sea bass and sea bream production in the Mediterranean. And you can see that for several different categories: acidification, global warming, land occupation, total energy use, fish feed production, which is the vertical bars, accounts for the vast majority of environmental impact. So the point about land occupation is important. This means that marine fish farms are using lots of land to produce fish feed. So actually, whether you site the farm on the land or in the water, it doesn't make a huge difference as to how much land it actually requires to produce all the feed that it's going to use. Okay, third point, there's a vast amount of space suitable for marine aquaculture. So this graph from Gentry et al. At the top is showing current finfish aquaculture production around the world. And then the panel below is a projection of what would happen if 1% of the suitable area of ocean of each country was developed for finfish aquaculture. And you can see that there's a huge increase in production. And they go on to say, if all areas designated as suitable in this analysis were developed, approximately 15 billion tons of finfish could be grown every year. That's over 100 times the current global seafood consumption. We have another sort of similar exercise based on geospatial analysis from the Caribbean that says the Caribbean's potential to cobia from mariculture is extremely large, with an approximate total production from suitable sites of 43 million metric tons. That's several orders of magnitude more cobia than is produced in the entire world from any source. So these are vast numbers. They don't really mean anything in terms of what's going to actually happen. So, but what purpose do they serve? I would argue that discursively they make it appear essentially inevitable that we're going to put at least part of this apparently blank space into productive use. And they also show the power of geospatial technologies to arbitrate or decide how oceanic space should be apportioned between different users on a sort of rational basis. So fourth point, mariculture's unrealized potential is presented as the result of policy failures. So Costello et al. Posed the question, If the potential for mariculture is so large, as we've seen in the last slide, why is our production so low? And they go on to explain that in terms of excessive regulation in some cases that prevents the establishment of farm, inadequate regulation, or regulation that is complex or ambiguous. And for them, that includes a lack of private property rights that hamper private investment. So the idea is if you can't exclude people from your farm, you're not going to make the investment, and there's not going to be investment in R&D for the same reason. So the solution, they argue, is to establish private property rights at sea, to introduce streamlined permitting processes, which presumably might be less stringent than at present, and to introduce marine spatial planning and zoning as a way to allocate ocean space amongst different groups of users. Okay, the fifth sort of theme that emerges is that mariculture is compatible with conservation objectives. And you can see this in the headlines from a number of recent articles. So coastal aquaculture and conservation can work together. So this again is a big break from the past. So 10, 15 years ago, generally most conservation organizations would probably make the case that mariculture was not very compatible with conservation. But we actually see a sort of explicit argument for shifting the narrative and paradigm of aquaculture's role in resource management. Why is this? I think the answer is in the articles below, which point to potential opportunities and synergies between aquaculture and marine protected areas. So mariculture is compatible with conservation objectives. Conservation has also become compatible with capital accumulation. And we see this beautifully illustrated in the front cover of this report, which was published by the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the largest conservation groups in the US, and Encourage Capital, which is an impact investment firm. And the report is titled Towards a Blue Revolution, Catalyzing Private Investment in Sustainable Aquaculture. They argue that marine aquaculture will require an additional $150 to $300 billion in investment by 2030. And they argue that this private capital investment can transform the sector and create alternatives to wild-caught fisheries while ensuring protection of marine ecosystems. And I think that really captures in a nutshell why there's been this sort of this union of these previously sort of estranged groups. Okay, so to summarize the implications, we have new alliances emerging around mariculture in the context of the policy space created by this move to promote a blue economy. And so this is bringing together scientists, environmental NGOs, philanthropies, governments, investors, who, some of whom at least previously might not have been, might not have worked together in this space. And so I think what we see is that given a choice between marine aquaculture, which is legible, can be regulated to some extent, and capture fisheries, which are unruly, very hard to govern and manage, aquaculture now appears to be the lesser of two evils for at least some of these groups. So mariculture expansion is going to support moves towards zoning and with that the privatization of marine space, and it will also, in doing so, strengthen forms of governmentality such as marine spatial planning that are also necessary for other extractive marine industries to become established in the oceans and for the expansion of marine protected areas. And I think really this is the sort of fundamental crux of the issue. So the push to expand marine aquaculture into offshore environments connects to wider attempts to enclose or intensify the exploitation of oceanic space and resources. The discourse that's deployed, the techno-scientific discourse that's deployed in these publications works to obscure the underlying neoliberal project. And in effect, the scientists involved are inventing societies on which their plans can be overwritten. So they're inventing, for instance, this scenario in which we have this rapidly growing population, ever-growing demand from seafood, and which cannot be fulfilled, and then they use that to support their plans. In sum, I think small-scale fishers and other less powerful marine resource users are likely to be subject to exclusions that result from the division and the reallocation of oceanic space amongst these groups of new actors that's taking place under the rubric of the blue economy. And I'll end there. This is the paper that the most of the ideas discussed today were taken from. So please go and look for it if you found this interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I'll hand the mic and the floor over to you, Julia.
Great, thank you much. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much for that, Ben, and thanks to Barb Nice and the rest of the working group for organizing this important discussion. I've been working with a couple of research networks over the last few years that are interested in what the social sciences and humanities can bring to these sorts of questions. With the Atlantic branch of the Royal Society of Canada in particular, we've been looking at the problem of sustainable oceans and sustainable diets, and pondering such questions such as why we aren't looking both more to more freshwater fish and to edible seafoods that are not high on consumer lists. We also need to think more about our need for seafood in the context of a fairly significant vegetarian and vegan population that may explain that plateauing that Ben was just talking about, and would also require rethinking our notion of how much fish is required to sustain us. Sustainable diets, of course, are crucially defined on terms that are culturally appropriate as well as economically accessible. And that requires attention not just to the most popular foods at a global scale, but also to more localized cultural practices and integration with coastal communities and other aspects of local food production and regional life. One of our recent projects was a policy brief on the importance of social science humanities to oceans policy. It was written for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, in which we noted in part the ways that colonization continues to shape the fishery in our region. Culture, though, doesn't just affect what we eat and what kinds of policies we develop, but also how we think and how we talk about things. I'm a humanities scholar, and what particularly strikes me about some of the quotations and headlines you've given us, Ben, is how very familiar they are. Blue growth discourse seems to be what we call parasitic, in the sense that it opportunistically hooks itself to two prior already powerful discourses. First, it echoes the term green growth as a term that already is paradoxical in pairing ecological sustainability with economic expansion. But two, it also draws on centuries of colonial discourse that justify acquisition by imagining territory as both unowned and plentiful with food. What these two discourses share is a kind of rhetorical bait and switch in which progress as a term for improvement is replaced by accumulation. Culture is accretive too in its way. Both creators and users of culture read, watch, and listen to old things as well as new things. Because of this, the imperial representation of empty land, terra nullius, is threaded through the fabric of Anglophone culture across centuries. To take one example, in the early 17th century, Sir Walter Raleigh declared, "Whosoever commands the sea commands the trade. Whosoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world, and consequently the world itself." In 2014, an MIT news item about an ocean systems management program favorably quoted this passage from Raleigh, but misdated it as 1829, so that a 17th century idea was rebundled as a 19th century idea for a 21st century oceans engineering audience. But through it all, controlling oceans was equated with growth of trade, of wealth, and of power. and Raleigh was not alone. Andrew Marvell's poem Bermudas, published in 1681, imagines the Bermudas as a new Eden, where God, quote, makes the figs our mouths to meet and throws the melons at our feet, along with pomegranates, apples, and oceans, all very high value foods in 17th century England. A century later, Mary Ann Parker assured English readers that Australia was full of food and that ostrich tastes just like beef. A century after that, Europeans were told to come to Canada and the United States, where land was cheap, empty, and as image after image promised, already developed into farmland. In the 20th century, from Westerns to science fiction, there were endless novels, short stories, TV shows, and movies where people load seasoned farm equipment onto a horse-drawn cart or a rocket ship. There's an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation where they talk about raising the seabed to form a new continent, another terra nullius. This all lies behind what Ben just described as science fiction images. We are culturally trained to find them, as he put it, appealing. And SF writers invent the social context in which those fantasies are played out, as we heard at the end of his talk. So why does this cultural history matter? First, we have a language for analyzing the kinds of tropes and narratives on which blue growth relies. Terra nullius, the doctrine of discovery, colonial discourse, Edenic imagery, progressive narratives. All of these help us talk about narrative as a construct rather than a description, and as manipulative rather than objective. I'm thinking here particularly of work like Reader's book, Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction. Second, this larger cultural history also matters because we have not only seen these narratives before, we have confronted them. Arguments against the enclosure of land in England date back at least to the levelers in the 17th century. In the 1820s, the poet John Clare sneered, "Fence now meets fence in owners' little bounds, in little parcels, little minds to please." And not just literature. Canada's Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples 25 years ago argued specifically against terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. And Indigenous literature and post-colonial literature have much to teach us about how these discourses work not only to solicit agreement, but also to erase complexity, avoid inconvenient truths, and push ethical concerns into the background. Blue growth is parasitic, but not intractable. If we continue to push back against the glossy, repurposed narratives of the industry, we can begin to see a conversation in which we can rethink how we can treat our oceans, how we understand unfenced spaces, and even what food we expect to eat, as well as draw better distinctions between science fiction and science fact. Thank you.
Over to you, Charlie. Thank you, Julia.
Okay, thanks, Julie. That was fascinating, and thanks, Ben, to your presentation. But I wanted to start by thanking the OFI Social Sciences and Humanities Working Group for setting up this really important speaker series that highlights outstanding work in the social sciences on the ocean. Okay, so thanks to Ben for such an interesting and thought-provoking intervention. I think what interests me most about the presentation and the paper on which it draws is how his work identifies a particular conjuncture around marine aquaculture. Conjuncture has two meanings. One is associated with a combination of circumstances that leads to a particular event or process. And that's certainly part of what is happening with marine aquaculture as it attempts to position itself in response to or as a solution to what is often articulated as one of the key global challenges facing the world, i.e. how to provide enough food to feed a population of 10 billion. But conjuncture also means a coming together or a union. And I think this is also clearly something that Ben has identified as different groups of people in new configurations are coming together around marine aquaculture. So this is a really important time to be reflecting on the dual character of what is this conjuncture. And I think the stakes are really high given the environmental and food security challenges that we face right now. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to build on the presentation that Ben presented and on the paper by thinking with him and with everyone here on the dual nature of this conjuncture. And I do so in two ways. So the first, I want to suggest that the conjuncture that Ben identifies around marine aquaculture is actually being actively reframed right now around protein. So it's not fish, wild caught or farmed, but protein, which is becoming the key area that is being discussed and around which marine aquaculture is positioning itself. So that's the first thing that I want to be talking about. The second thing also has to do with the conjuncture. And here I want to broaden the discussion out to think about how the groups that are being assembled around marine aquaculture are part of a broader process of global governance around food that has been there for a while, but has come into sharp relief in the UN Food System Summit, the call for Blue Foods Assessment, and in COP26, which is happening right now. Okay, so on to the first point. So in the paper, in the presentation, Ben focuses on marine aquaculture and raises some critical questions about the economic, technological, environmental, and social challenges facing the sector. A sector that is making ambitious and, I think we would agree, unrealistic claims on its ability to nourish the world. And Ben's overall conclusion is to suggest an emphasis on freshwater aquaculture that happens on land, that this system of production has much greater potential to address human equity and food security. And overall, I agree with his assessment. But here's the complication. Marine aquaculture is increasingly positioning itself not so much against other forms of farmed fish production or even wild capture fisheries. It is instead comparing itself against other livestock production systems. And the common denominator here is not fish or even food, but it is protein. So when protein is the common denominator, things for marine aquaculture look different because the metrics that are being presented make finfish aquaculture look really good when compared to the production of meat/protein on land. And we can see this shift in register through the recent Blue Foods Assessment and through the mobilization of data by major corporations producing finfish or their representative organizations. So I think the data being presented by the marine aquaculture industry on efficiency in greenhouse gases through protein needs to be properly interrogated, because I think a lot of it is very weak and very partial. But I think it's important to see and recognize and even respond to this repositioning of marine aquaculture by the key actors in the current context. So it's to recognize how key actors in marine aquaculture are reframing how they plan to nourish the world, not through fish, but through protein. And I'd be interested in hearing Ben and others, their thoughts on this and its broader implications. So the second part of my discussion is about how the conjuncture that Ben identifies is around the conjuncture around marine aquaculture. So Ben shows that there's a new coalition of actors previously opposed to marine aquaculture who now see the potential for this sector around the blue economy, blue growth, and even blue foods. And this new coalition connects NGOs, academics, philanthropies, and foundations, as well as large corporations around the blue economy. And that this group has now decided that marine aquaculture is the better option than wild capture fisheries. And Ben argues that the risk is that it will lead to the conditions where ocean spaces are grabbed for the benefit of private capital and conservation interests. And I think this goes some way to answering one of Ben's really key questions, which is, why have these narratives emerged as a cohesive whole at this time? And what purpose do they serve? But I think we might reframe this important question to whose interests do they serve? And the problem here is that the interests that they serve end up being those of large corporations that are increasingly dominating not only the food system itself, but the multilateral debates on food. And we've seen this most starkly in the UN Food System Summit, as well as through COP26. And I think we should be genuinely worried about corporate influences in what is being called the Blue Foods Assessment. Corporate influence is a problem for several different reasons. For one, it transforms these meetings from where organizations are essentially regarded as being on a more or less equal footing, to one where more powerful groups begin to set the agenda for problems like global food insecurity. And that's a problem when it's big corporations who are often at the root of food insecurity problems are seen as actors that can somehow sort out the problems that they themselves have created. And it's especially a problem when the solutions themselves end up benefiting what is an already highly concentrated food sector. So I think in making these points around the specific conjuncture, I think I want to sort of highlight the importance of Ben's work, and I think it's incredibly valuable in opening up these discussions in a critical way. So I hope these comments help generate some additional thinking, discussion, and of course responses to the challenges that have been identified. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlie. So I'll invite, now both of the discussants, respondents have shared quite substantial considerations and elaborations of their own on Ben's talk. So I'm going to suggest that we have a shortened, a curtailed discussion amongst the three of us to enable us to stay somewhat on track to allow for a full Q&A. The questions are beginning to come in. So those of you who are, everyone on this webinar, please feel free to begin to submit in the question and answer box your questions. And if we could perhaps have a quick discussion now, maybe 7-8 minutes between the three, as opposed to the longer discussion we thought we might have. And perhaps just a few salient points in response. Ben, if you'd like to respond to start off to either or both Charlie and Julia, that would be a good way to begin.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I think my video has been turned off.
Not by me.
Okay, the host had disabled it. Anyway, thank you, Julia and Charlie, for the thoughtful interventions. I was really taken by with what you said, Julia. I love the idea of parasitic discourse. It really seems quite appropriate here, and also the links to colonial discourses that you draw, and the idea of the rebundling of ideas really strikes a chord. So in an earlier version of the presentation, I did actually include a slide that was talking about the work of Warren Belasco, who's a historian of the future of food. And he has a wonderful paper called Algae Burgers for a Hungry World, in which he sets out how after the Second World War, there was a very similar discourse around the need to feed a rapidly growing population, the need for radical, novel, futuristic sort of interventions to feed the world, and how there was a huge amount of interest and research on an investment in producing this chlorella algae as a food source for humanity, which ultimately came to nothing. So yeah, really sort of resonates strongly with sort of how I've understood these discourses. So yeah, to move on to Charlie's points, I'm not sure I necessarily recognize sort of this reframing around protein. I mean, certainly there are all kinds of exercises kind of benchmarking the environmental impacts of different elements of the diet. And, you know, seafood is normally reduced to a single category, quite often sort of taking salmon as the standard and you know, compared to other terrestrial meats, and usually comes out looking kind of similar to chicken, but a lot better certainly than beef or pork. And so actually we've sort of been in the sort of work that I do with WorldFish, we've been sort of fighting a long battle to actually sort of change the discourse away from protein and towards micronutrients. Actually, there's no major shortage of protein in the diet of most people around the world, but there are quite acute micronutrient shortages often. And actually, I see some of that discourse being picked up in some of these articles that are starting to talk about how mariculture is going to feed malnourished populations, which again, 10 years ago, nobody would have ever thought to say that. And so, yeah, I think in the interest of time, I will just stop there.
Should I just jump in, Ian? Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm thinking about the motivations for those glossy brochures and those fantastic graphics, which are not cheap to put together. You've probably got a communications team that is trying to figure out exactly how to pitch this in a way that's going to be appealing. And obviously a high priority is going to be getting that $150 million US, billion dollars US, whatever the figure was, investment into these kinds of projects. That's the first goal. But I wonder how much governments are jumping on board, because it that helps them avoid very significant social and political questions in relation to how we manage food scarcity and insecurity right now, and a capitalist culture that is driven by endless consumption and more acquisition. It's very hard for governments to turn around and say, please don't spend as much. Please don't buy a new TV. Please don't get the next phone. Please think about how much you eat. Please don't throw food away. Those are going to require significant cultural changes in the West. And they avoid all that by saying, it's okay. 5 years from now, we're going to have this amazing mariculture that's going to solve all of our problems. So I wonder how much this blue growth discourse then is a distraction from having real discussions about things like food waste. I'm thinking here of Tamara Soma's work on food systems and how much waste there is. So it's not even about the specific content, the specific goals of mariculture. It's just about putting something on the table, so to speak, that will distract people from the real challenges that face us if we're going to solve these problems, including food insecurity and starvation around the world.
I mean, I think there are sort of real resources at stake here. There's a kind of a genuine political economy to all of this at lots of different scales, sort of both at the the scale of governments or companies securing access to areas of marine space, but also at a smaller scale, organizations or individuals securing funding for different sorts of projects. And it's all kind of bound up together. So I think there are sort of real world implications of all of this.
Charlie, do you have anything to?
No, I mean, I would just sort of maybe think about, it was interesting to sort of think about our two responses to Ben's paper. I think Judy have kind of focused more on the sort of historical antecedents of this and parallels and continuities. I think there's some quite specific things happening around the blue economy right now, which are different than before. So it's almost certainly a kind of combination of both historical antecedents, colonialism, grabbing, that kind of thing, as well as some quite specific things that are happening around the ocean economy now that I think we need to attend to. I think the idea of this 2050 10 billion thing is something that I don't think has been on the agenda before, and certainly, at least discursively, drives a lot of the kind of arguments around what needs to be done around the ocean economy. The ocean frontier is an old idea. We know from Helen Rozadowski's work, but I think the way in which the frontier is being mobilized now is also maybe somewhat different than before. And it's important to recognize both continuities as well as specific dynamics that are a part of the current kind of conjuncture. Yeah, so it just made me think that it would be an interesting thing to sort of think through that.
Yeah. I think in keeping with the sort of frontier theme, and also came up in Julia's remarks, I mean, the other big frontier is space, right? And that's also seeing a lot of renewed interest at the moment. And so it's like capital is sort of expanded as far as it can on land, and so there has to be the search for new frontiers for accumulation to keep going, and so yeah, it's maybe not a coincidence almost that these fish farms kind of look like spaceships in a way,
I'm going to dive in, if I may, as moderator, and begin to bring in some of the questions coming into the Q&A. And I'd like to begin with the most recent, which is by Yuri Schultens, who thanks you, Ben, and has to leave, which is why I'm beginning with them. And just bringing up that traveling, the issue of traveling in either the traveling of these narratives, either geographically, or in terms of various kinds of actors, is it actually possible to trace these travels? That is to say, the travels of the narratives themselves and the discursive terms that constitute them. So that's just throwing that out there as a question. I believe that Yuri has had to leave. So just beginning with Mark Butler's questions, do you have any thoughts on the intersection of genetic engineering and aquaculture? Genetic engineering and aquaculture. There are concerns around genetic pollution of nature, issues about ownership of species through genetic engineering, and respect for indigenous rights when it is a species of traditional use, such as salmon, that is in question. And this is a question for all three.
I guess this is not something that I've thought about a great deal. So I mean, I guess one of the big questions is, you know, are genetically engineered fish going to be acceptable to consumers? And so there's already a genetically engineered salmon, Aqua Bounty salmon, that's been licensed after a very, very long process, maybe 20 years or so, for production in the US, I believe now, and it's has to be grown in enclosed systems. It's not grown in the sea, and so yeah, it's not clear to what extent consumers will accept this, but I guess the US has a history of being more sort of accepting of GM than Europe or many other parts of the world. So I think it's difficult to know what the future holds. Really, is this a step too far, or for consumers, or will it be something that actually gains acceptance? And then yeah, in terms of what that means for sort of indigenous genetic resources, it's difficult for me to say. Yeah.
I can maybe respond a little bit. Mark will tell you that the issue around consumer acceptance is a challenging one because, at least in Canada, genetically modified salmon don't have to be labeled. So consumers wouldn't really know whether they are eating a genetically modified salmon or not. So it makes the problem of consumer acceptance somewhat moot. But I mean, I think that, and it maybe kind of connects a bit to Jennifer Silver's question there that I'm sure Ian will speak to now. I mean, the concern obviously around genetic modification in agrarian contexts is around how big companies end up being able to control the entire value chain, and in particular, what happens on farms. So that's the kind of concern around, I think the big concern around that. And I don't know what work has been done around that in terms of salmon, you know, the extent to which there are other connections that happen as genetically modified salmon get used. In other words, are there specific feeds? Are there specific other kinds of conditions for that end up then controlling the chain? I'm not quite sure whether that happens. But it also speaks, Ben, to your other point. Sorry, Julia, I'll come to you now, which is the comparison between salmon and guinea fowl that you have in your presentation, right? So again, I think it's probably another step in the continued development of a very specific species of fish that end up then not looking like other kinds of fish production or other kinds of aquaculture. Sorry, Julia, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wonder if we want to give some space to thinking about the ways in which consumer concerns about genetically modified foods is a concern of populations that experience plenty, not the ones who are experiencing scarcity. There's what's often considered one of the first environmental novels, John Brunner's Sheep Look Up, where there is a food that is very cheaply produced and is sent out to vulnerable populations around the world. And there are no controls on the safety of that food. And because of a series of environmental disasters, the water that is used to make the food is contaminated, and it leads to mass violence because of what it does to people's brains. So what Brunner was thinking through in the early 70s was the ways in which standards of food differ based on the amount of privilege and economic power you have. So while that is happening, another thread of the narrative is about how rich people are buying oxygen and are buying organically protected foods and paying a lot of money to get food that is pure and is very, very carefully produced. So he was interested in that divide. So when we talk about genetically modified fish, are we thinking about feeding the world, or are we thinking about a profitable industry that serves a niche market in North America, where food is largely plentiful and accessible?
I'm not sure whether or not we've dwelt on this theme. We can double back to it. There is a question from Jennifer Silver, who asks whether do the panelists see productive pathways for discussion with colleagues in the natural sciences, who in turn often go on to work in the conservation sector and government. Is it worthwhile drawing on analogous examples? I presume Jennifer means of such discussions with natural scientists from the past, i.e. in the discourse around the Green Revolution. Ben, I'm assuming your paper is the result of many such conversations, as is Charlie and Julia's work.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I think the most obvious sort of immediate parallels here are sort of with a lot of the work that's been done on actually what's referred to as green grabbing. So similar, not in the context of a blue economy, but similar processes of enclosure of commons for the purposes of conservation. So there are many examples of this sort of taking place, on land, and many of the processes are extremely similar. Sort of the crisis narratives, the way that they're constructed, perhaps sort of the sort of the way in which these spaces are imagined being devoid of people, perhaps, so I think that's a clear sort of link to another set of scholarship that's very analogous, and so perhaps there are examples there from that sort of people working in that space of how they've been able to engage. I mean, certainly, we have to be sort of careful to sort of tar all conservation with the same brush, right? There are kind of a variety of different organizations sort of working in that space that have different approaches, and so it would be interesting to see sort of how those conversations have gone.
Charlie, Julia, any thoughts particularly about the question about crossing between social science, humanities, and natural sciences in Jennifer's question?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of conversations we need to have that work across the disciplines. And too often, I think things get reduced to scientific communications, but what we really need to do is start thinking about these discourses and these methodologies And frankly, the way that we've been artificially divided into these disciplinary silos, we are all working on similar topics from slightly different vantage points. There's a body of work now that's been around for about a decade or so under the category Blue Humanities that's interested in oceans. We have discourses of green growth and critiques of it that have happened in literature and poetry, and I can think of a couple of songs even, as well as through advocacy discourse, social sciences, discussions of displaced peoples and what climate change is doing to that, and how agriculture has caused problems around the world when it is being driven by colonial ideologies and consumer markets rather than local needs. There's a lot of work that's been done on that in Africa, for instance, about how the move to cash crops under colonization basically stripped the ecology and made them dependent on the market price of things like coffee and cocoa, where things that you cannot live on, and displace foods that people could live on, and how that contributed to the food scarcity we were talking about a few minutes ago. So we're talking about, one of the things I find myself saying a lot is, if the problem is people and how we have messed up the environment, then we need to think about how people work and our societies and our cultures and how those interact. But certainly the natural sciences need to be brought into this discussion. They've got experience with issues of climate change and green growth more generally, but also the history of our disciplines, the ways in which they have been bundled to serve particular projects. So I'm thinking here of Eric Mills' work on the history of ocean studies, and the way it started off as a military project because of World War II. And sort of built out from there. What does it mean to work in a set of disciplines that have as their origin serving military concerns about protecting land? And you can take that all the way back to the 18th century and the development of the cannon shot rule, that coastal territory extended as far as a cannon shot because that's how much territory you could defend. And now as our technology takes us further and further out, at what point do our lines start to cross and create other international problems that the idea of mariculture sort of pushes aside by thinking about things not in terms of national territory, but in terms of corporate ownership, which is a much more fluid, so to speak, project. So I'm pointing about 10 different directions, but yes, I think interdisciplinarity is really crucial to solving the problems we face.
How far does our patent shoot? Julia's reference to Eric Mills is a retired professor of oceanography here at Dalhousie, who also was the founder of the History of Science and Technology program that I have the pleasure of teaching in at the University of King's College.
So maybe I'll just, Ian, if I could just add an 11th element to Julia's 10. And slightly in response to Jennifer's comment, because it's a really good one. And, you know, thinking about the Green Revolution makes me think the extent to which often when we're doing scholarship, say on the oceans, we kind of ignore land relations. And I think the key thing looking historically is how intertwined these have always been and how intertwined they still are. So when we think of marine sources of feed, those historically went into not only agriculture, but also into livestock production, pigs and chickens. It was only with the rise of salmon aquaculture that it shifted into that kind of feed. And now we're seeing it shift away again. And as Ben said in his presentation, salmon becoming increasingly vegetarian. So those relations between land and sea have always been there. And we do ourselves a massive disservice by thinking that these two food systems are separate, when in fact they're totally interlinked.
Let me just give space to some of the other questions. There is a practical question which I actually would love to know the answer to as well, which is from Daniel Jensen. Will Ben's PowerPoint be made available somewhere, or maybe is it possible to receive it by email? I also would like to add as moderator that I think many of us would love to see whether or not the comments by our discussants could appear perhaps in blog form or posted on the website for this event. And I only work here, so I don't know the technical answer to that. So this is a question which we, that I say, how the post access to this event and what was shared, that's a matter for us perhaps to think about as a panel and as an OFI group. Ben, if you want to email, obviously you're free to do what you wish relative to your presentation. Anonymous attendee asks a practical question to Ben. What is the most, or perhaps a theoretical one, what is the most appropriate pathway forward to address the impact of feed production in aquaculture?
Yeah, good question. Not necessarily an easy question to answer. I mean, I think the links that Charlie draws between land and sea and how sort of flows of feed ingredients are connected across of space is a really important one. And we have a whole variety of different resources flowing all across the globe, really, that are going into the production of aquaculture feeds and of course other animal feeds. So I mean, there are sort of specific efforts around certification of feed ingredients, fish meal, fish oil from sustainable sources, perhaps sustainable soy, but obviously those are only going to sort of account for a very small fraction of the global production of aqua feeds and aquaculture fish. So, you know, typically only maybe 5 or 6% of global aquaculture production is actually certified. So, and certification is certainly not a panacea. I think there are a lot of sort of interesting developments going on, technological developments in terms of sort of advances in feed ingredients, but these also are not going to be panaceas. Typically sort of replacements for fish meal, fish oil are going to be, or well, I'm not sure that there are necessarily good replacements, but replacements for fish oil are going to be very expensive. There are also kind of trade-offs when you shift between different sources of ingredients. So it's not, you can't necessarily assume that sort of reducing fish meal content in a fish feed and replacing that with a vegetable source feed is necessarily going to be more or rather less impactful, sort of taken as a whole. So yeah, I'm not sure that there is one single pathway. There are probably many different pathways, and those will sort of change over time.
Question here from Michael Skladany, essentially about how neoliberal agendas get distilled or winnowed out into policy documents, policy orientations, so that we end up with, through policy, the foxes guarding the chicken coop, as Michael puts it, presumably chickens that are bred for roasting. Much more empirically oriented and grounded critical assessments need to be introduced into this discourse, presumably assessments of policy in particular. And those of you who are natural scientists wondering why we social science and humanities are constantly worried about discourse and language, it's because, as Dr. Belton's talk shows, language does control a very great deal about what happens in the natural space. Any three of you in response to that question?
Yeah, thank you for the intervention. I mean, I very much agree. There's a lot of, you know, sort of very high level sort of modeling or conceptual work that's used to sort of construct these discourses. There's much, well, actually there is kind of empirical work going on of a sort of technical variety. In sort of that's much less kind of high profile, and actually is sometimes rather more balanced, I find. but there are a few sort of empirically grounded assessments of how this sort of the blue growth is really playing out on the ground. And so there's really a big need for trying to understand what are the actual sort of material effects of this discourse that are starting to emerge. And so, yeah, I entirely agree with that point.
Yeah, I would add to that I think one of the things we need to be concerned about once we move into these sorts of, don't want to call them gray spaces because they're technically blue spaces, but these spaces that are on the fringes of national sovereignty and public surveillance because they are largely hidden from view. Historically, that has caused a lot of problems. We don't just have policies that are failing to oversee. We have activities that are taking place in spaces that are difficult to oversee. And that, I think, poses a real risk to the sustainability of what they're doing, as well as the viability. I mean, if you think about the attempts to deal with the excessive attacks on whales and the whaling industry. A lot of that has taken place in international waters or beyond the kinds of surveillance we take for granted in the modern state. And for that reason, it's been very difficult to manage. And the more this gets pushed into those unregulated or unregulatable spaces, the easier it is for those kinds of neoliberal policies to take root. And this is where the increasing power of corporations over our governments and the increasing power of multinational corporations in particular to evade governments. And we might think here about recent discussions of tax evasion by Apple and Facebook and on and on and on. The more it sort of escapes that net, the harder it is for us to develop policies and practices that are going to serve the collective interest rather than the individual interest of those corporations. And just quickly to Ian's point about the importance of language, one of the things that struck me listening to Ben's paper is we're not going to see the tagline, squeezing more profit out of the ocean, right? They are using happy fuzzy phrases to conceal what is really going on here. And that's the work of government in its best sense, is to dig down beneath the surface and to talk about what's really happening and what benchmarks really need to be met for this to be done safely and productively and in our long-term interest as well as our short-term interest.
We have only a few more minutes and just a couple of things I want in case we run out of time. So this webinar will end at on the half hour or depending on where you are. Newfoundland or here. And so we, first thing is that there is one question by, an observation by Dean Babington at MUN. Must be stated that MUN incubated and helped commercialize the aqua bounty salmon. So just an observation that perhaps doesn't require further discussion, or perhaps it does in other context. Also that just to remind folks that this webinar is recorded and will be posted on the OFI YouTube channel section for this webinar series. So if you want to hear, but also perhaps a question to Ben, whether or not your presentation as such as a deck can be shared or not. That's perhaps we can discuss that. And I would repeat also the thought that this very rich intervention by our two discussants, which is quite substantive. I'm sure I certainly would love to see it in some kind of written form, but it is recorded so people can reflect on it as well. I think we have honored all of the questions that have emerged. I'm going to check one more time. Yes, that is the case. So please, we're coming to the end of the event, and I think we just have a few 3 more minutes. And before we thank the speakers, are there any final thoughts that you have? And if there is a silence, I have one question which I want to ask, which is very brief.
Sorry, Ian, there's a question by Ratana on the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that. In the Q&A?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't see it. Oh, I have the wrong window open. I do apologize, Ratana. Mariculture is positioning itself as a solution to food security problem, despite all the problems that it is causing, as clearly illustrated by Ben? What can be offered as an alternative and real or realistic solution, as a real and realistic solution to food security?
Eliminate food waste. Eliminating food waste would be such a huge step to solving the food security problems we face right now.
Yeah, I would say understanding food insecurity as a problem of access rather than production. There's a sort of assumption that we need to produce more food. It's not the case.
Yeah, thanks, Ratana. I mean, certainly maintaining capture fisheries is going to be really important. And so I guess I didn't get into this too much in this presentation, but you know, clearly capture fisheries, and particularly small-scale capture fisheries, as you well know, are extremely important for food security. And so really, on the one hand, maintaining their ability to keep producing the food that they do, and then also augmenting that, I would say, with less impactful forms of freshwater aquaculture are particularly important from the supply side. Obviously, there are distributional issues and issues to do with you know, how much do we, and there are lots of different we's, but how much do certain sort of groups of people need to consume as opposed to others.
There are a couple of questions that have just come in, and we really have 1 minute left, so I'm going to have to choose one from Nova. I mean, what do you think about offshore marine finfish farming versus offshore Mpas in terms of food security and conservation concerns?
So I'm not totally clear what the comparison is.
I can't help. Well, we'll leave that perhaps there. I just want to remind everyone that this event is recorded, and secondly that there is our next webinar series, to which we heartily invite you to take part, is on the 8th of December at 12:30 Atlantic Standard Time, 1 o'clock Newfoundland Standard Time. Seafarers in industrial fishing, examining migrant worker precarity. That's on December 8th, and you can find the details of that on the OFI website link for this series. Please join me, everybody, in some way or other, virtually at home or with your hand clapping symbol, to thank our two discussants, Dr. Charlie Mather, Dr. Julia Wright, and our presenter, Dr. Ben Belton. Thank you so much, all three of you, for this incredibly enlightening and substantive and provocative discussion.